the Hades Persephone story. When I was younger, I was just kind of swept up in the idea of it, and and I loved it, and I still love it. But also at the same time, there's so many different avenues you can take with it, and it's yes, to me there is a little bit of Stockholm syndrome there. If you are truly believing in the side of the myth where he plots to kidnap her essentially and take her down to the underworld, and eventually she'll love me. There's that side of it. Then there's some that say that she went down there and she had the choice of staying or not, but then she ate the fruit even though he warned her, and then she's stuck there. So there's so many different avenues, but I guess I've never been a huge fan of the Stockholm syndrome one.
Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vicky Lawn, and each episode, I and a guest will unpack a fiction trope with an eye for character development and narrative structures. Make sure to look for Speculative Sandbox on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, where you can join the conversation. Leave comments or questions, or let us know what other tropes we should cover. When the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one. Greek mythology set the standard for many story tropes and character archetypes seen in today's fiction. From tragedies to triumphant battles, petty arguments to unrequited love, the Greek gods continue to leave a lasting impression because they're undeniably relatable. USA Today best-selling romance author Carly Spade joins me in talking about the allure of the Greek gods. We discuss some of their shadier pasts, as well as Carly's approach for retelling their stories to a modern audience. Tell me about yourself, your work, your latest novels. Tell me all about it.
Sure. So I'm Carly Spade. I am an indie author. I live in Colorado with my husband and my 2 fur dog babies. And as far as my work goes, so I actually do have a day job currently. I hope to become a full-time writer soon, but for right now, to pay the bills, so to speak, I'm actually a program mentor for a university helping cybersecurity hopefuls get through their cybersecurity degrees, as that is what my master's is in. Ironically, it is not writing.
Oh, very cool. Same. I'm similar too. I have a day job that's completely unrelated to my writing.
Right. Yeah. And actually, I'm A-okay with that. Because if I were writing for my day job plus also trying to write fantasy worlds, I think it would just be a little overwhelming, to be honest with you.
A lot of computer. Yeah. Well, I guess you do have computer time, but it's in a different way. It's numbers, I'm guessing, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. And actually, most of my job spent there is talking to people on the phone. So it's completely, and it actually is nice because it's a remote job, and in between calls and downtime, I have the opportunity to be writing during the day, which I know a lot of people that have day jobs too and write don't have that advantage. So I feel very thankful for that. But yeah, that's what I do for a day job. And yes, like I said, I do have a master's in cyber. I do try to write as often as I can some of the stuff that I've actually earned those degrees into my writing. I do find ways here and there. And as far as new releases and upcoming things, my contemporary mythos series is getting ready to wrap up for the main series anyway. Can't say too much else than that, but just know that the characters, we will be visiting them again. Even though Zeus will be the last book of the main, releasing April 25th. Poseidon just came out March 25th, actually came out a little earlier than expected, but it did come out at the end of March. And yeah, so those 2, that one just came out, and Zeus will be wrapping up the main series of book 6 for the Contemporary Mythos series. So.
That's so exciting that you're writing about Greek mythology. I love Greek mythology. And when you and I connected briefly over email, we discovered we have a shared love for Xena and Hercules. So yes. Tell me how you first got into Greek mythology, and what did you love about Xena and Hercules?
So I think most of us, especially I'm an 80s, born in the 80s, raised in the 90s baby, but I feel that a lot of people from that era, born of those decades, definitely had Greek mythology starting at maybe in middle school. They really, really go into it pretty deep. And for me, it was constant. And then I got to dabble in other mythologies, but Greek was definitely something that has been in my schooling since I was in middle school. That's where I first got introduced to it. However, when I really got into it, it really was with Xena and Hercules, the TV shows. I was absolutely obsessed. Meaning, I mean, my entire room was Xena Warrior Princess for I don't even know how long. I went to conventions. My parents were awesome and took me. I got to meet some of the actors, and I was just absolutely in love with those shows. And I loved that they did this style of, okay, the Greek gods and everything actually do exist. They communicate with the characters, the main characters. They're interwoven. They did retellings. They kind of put their own spin on some of the myths, and it made me want to go out there and actually, research, what did they actually take from the actual myth, and then what did they take license with. So it kind of helped me learn along the way, and they're just so fun. The shows were absolutely fun. They were funny, slapstick humor, and I absolutely loved it. And it was a huge inspiration for me throughout my entire childhood, and obviously into adulthood. I've pulled even from those shows, even for my current writings. So
yeah, it's so fun now because I recognize, I've been reading other books too, where I recognize tiny little hints that go, they watched Xena growing up, whether it's, symbolism in their stories or cultural, like where you shake hands, but you're shaking each other's wrists or forearms,
Yep. Yes.
I was like, oh, that's a tell. I'm so jealous because I also decorated my bedroom. I did not have parents that took me to conventions. I would have killed to meet. I remember when I was like, I don't know, in middle school, I was like, my biggest dream is to meet Lucy Lawless.
Oh,
And
yeah.
yet to happen. In my case, so I had the same exact situation. Middle school curriculum, you have the Greek gods, and I felt like I had an advanced knowledge because I was already watching Xena and Hercules, despite how they may have warped the stories, but it was still delightful. But I remember when I was 7, that my parents got me this things your second grader needs to know book, and they had the Greek gods in there. Looking back, I'm like, wow, that's pretty advanced. But I just like became obsessed from that point on because I remember thinking, superheroes are for kids. My parents don't pay attention to that stuff, but here I am reading about belief systems that were wholly believed by full societies, back in the day. And so for me, that was just so great. And then it turned into, Disney's Hercules that came out. Then there are Percy Jackson books and, so on and so forth.
Yes, Disney's Hercules was also a big one for me too. I mean, that actually started my initial. As I watched it several times, even as a kid, I said, Hades isn't really. I mean, I think people are giving him a bad rep. This isn't fair because Zeus is kind of just as big of a meanie, honestly, to me as Hades is. He's kind of being very mean to his brother.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm a little shady because I took a Greek myth class in college, and I'm a little shaky on it. But I just remember Zeus and Hades really being, you really can't say one is better than the other. They're matters of circumstance and privilege. It seems like Poseidon is the one brother that's kind of just doing his thing. Maybe I'm kind of shady on my memory though.
Yeah. So, I mean, I did a lot of research recently. I had to, I came into this series with, general good knowledge of Greek myths, but I have learned so much even in these past couple of years from doing this series of things that I had either forgotten or didn't realize or didn't really dig too deep into. And the dynamic between the three brothers is actually something I go into really heavy in Zeus. And it is actually very interesting to see how each of them actually do lend into the just keeping Olympus afloat. It's not just one or the other. It's all three of them truly lend something. The only thing I'll say about Poseidon, and I had to be careful with my book too, is he, like Zeus, has a bit of a reputation for certain things. And specifically also Medusa. And I really wanted to make sure that I wanted my world to be, not necessarily a utopia, but I wanted it to not be maybe as tragic, because the whole point of my series is to make people laugh and swoon and maybe cry tears of joy. So obviously Greek mythology has a lot of tragedy.
Yes.
And that was something that I just chose as an author to take creative license on and try to, even if there was some stuff that I actually said, yes, that did happen, they are redeeming themselves. And Poseidon, definitely, that's a case there. So So I've always viewed Hades as the most level-headed, to be honest with you, and I think that's the reason why Zeus gave him the underworld, because he knew that himself and Poseidon would have never been able to hack it, and the underworld would have crumbled because they just that's always been kind of my take, is that Hades was the only one mentally, I feel, prepared to be able to do that. And it still makes him, this kind of emo guy, because it's kind of depressing being in darkness all the time. And
yes, emo and
yeah.
alluring and mysterious and all these
Yes.
wonderful traits that we could think about.
Yes. But I really truly think that, and I go really heavy into it in the Zeus book, even that I think that was one thing that Zeus actually, they're trying to make it seem like he did Hades, I'm banishing you to the underworld. And I don't necessarily see it as that. I see it as, yes, I know you got a bad deal with having to be down here. However, you were the only one that could have done it. You were the only one because you have the head for it. And it's almost kind of a compliment in a way to me. So
Interesting. I love that take. Okay, so then of all the Greek gods, we can look at the major 12 or any of the minor gods. Who is your favorite and why?
So when I was a kid and learning mythology, as we just talked about, and Xena and Hercules and all that, I would have said Apollo and Aphrodite without even thinking about it. And especially also Aphrodite, because of Xena and Hercules. I absolutely loved the version of her on those shows. However, as an adult, now the past 2 years, I actually would say now Ares and Zeus.
Okay.
And now Ares, obviously I liked Ares on the shows because it was Kevin Smith and he was amazing on those shows. Yeah. But just the character himself, you read, especially Homer, man, did he gave Ares a what for. I did so much research, and it was actually the same type of things that I was seeing repeated with both Ares and Zeus. And it really was who is telling the story about them, because you can tell if they were a fan or they were not. And I think that Homer, being an Athenian, kind of, lent towards Athena, put her in this, ethereal light. And he always did everything he could to put Ares in a more negative light. Whereas the Spartans, they didn't do that. They put him actually in a better light. And I read, their versions of the stories and the myths of Ares, and he's actually this really awesome alpha hero macho guy who's actually a bit of a sweetheart and likes to dance. So
interesting. Okay, so Ares is the god of war and Athena is the god of wisdom and military strategy. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would you say they're the same side, different sides to the same coin?
Yes, and it was interesting because basically from my research and what I gathered is that Ares is basically more Sparta, god of war, if you want it in a better light, and then Athena represents Athens. So there was obviously always an actual contention between Sparta and Athens, and so those gods represented each of them. And I think that that's why, with Homer being of Athens, he put Ares in that, he had the power of the quill and put him in that bad light. But that is why I actually learned to like him a lot, because, I also never really, I know a lot of people love the story of Ares and Aphrodite, but obviously for my series, I really didn't want to include incest. I know it was a big part of the Greek myths, but for trying to do modern retellings and making them into romantic comedies, not exactly the best thing. So
can you summarize what that original Ares and Aphrodite mythology was?
Yeah, so it's basically supposed to be love and war, and I completely get it, and I love the initial, intent behind it, and obviously they are brother and sister, and she is married to Hephaestus, and she cheats on him with Ares because it's this clandestine love between the two of them. Again, love and war, the balance and all that, and I like the idea behind it. I love it, of course, but for me, trying to do what I was trying to do, I also have always loved the story of Aphrodite and Hephaestus and the potential behind that too, inner versus outer beauty, and the blessings and cursings of both of them when you're really wrapped up in one or the other. So I feel that story, actually, they kind of missed a lot they could have done with that too. And they really concentrated on this whole thing between brother and sister.
Yeah. Because Hephaestus is the one, he's like a bit homely. He's making tools, correct?
Yeah, he's the god of the forge,
Mm-hmm.
and he is said to have this huge, gnarly scar down one side of his face, which he was so ugly that Hera threw him off of Olympus.
Jeez.
Yeah, it was so sad, that Hera, and she, in certain myths, she didn't have any guy that made her pregnant with him, which is what I went with, so that him and Aphrodite aren't related either. So I went with that version of the story where Hera created him to get back at Zeus. And she's like, I'm going to make my own kid. And unfortunately, when he was born, to her, he was ugly as sin. So she tossed him off Olympus. So that really, so I really have always liked that aspect of between Aphrodite and Hephaestus. So that's why I kind of went with that route with my story. And then Zeus too has become a really quick favorite because I was really, really hellbent on debunking, everybody's absolute hatred for him. I told myself, if Ares has these other elements that I've been able to find, there has to be stuff with Zeus. And I found so many things, and even just the William Shakespeare quote of "heavy is the head that wears the crown." That is a huge theme in my entire story, is because I don't think that people give him enough credit. And you can't just say that all those stories of him cheating on his wife countless times and sleeping with all these women and turning himself into animals and gold mist and all these crazy stories. You really think that, let's even just say it's real. Let's say mythology was real. How much of that do you actually think would be real? So.
Well, it sounds to me like if you're ever in a situation where you were in a relationship with somebody and you're thinking, this guy's going to be in my life, and then maybe he pieces out for whatever reason, and now you're in trouble with the parents, you're like, Zeus did it, and I'm
Yes.
not responsible.
Yes, 100%. Yes, that's exactly what and a big part of even the historical accounts that I was reading of people kind of going into what their theories were. That was a huge one. They used Zeus to make sense and give reason for their taboos and their, what they want to do. They want to be able to, well, Zeus cheated on his wife, and there's no problem with me doing it. He's king of the gods.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a huge theme that I went with as well. And he just kind of allowed it because, he is of the people, and he is as much of a king of the gods as he is a king of humanity. And if they need to do that, to be able to make sense of their lives and to be comfortable and to basically use them as their sounding board, then so be it. That he'll deal with it. So because of that, and he's such a powerful character, and he did, everybody forgets that he did save his brothers and do all this stuff. So I think people just get really wrapped up in the cheating factor, and there's so much more to him that I really have grown very fond of that god, for sure.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So then why do you think we've talked about what we love about Greek mythology, our favorite character? Well, actually, I just realized I haven't shared my favorite character yet.
Yes, please.
My favorite character, I think from being very young, I actually really loved Artemis, just because there's this liberated woman, aspect to her where she's out in the forest doing her thing, free spirit, dangerous and a little scary. Don't mess with her. And I always liked that aspect of her. I didn't really dive too much further into it. I just, I enjoyed that freedom, that sense of freedom that's associated with her. Okay, so why do you think Greek mythology resonates so strongly with our modern audience?
So I truly think that Greek mythology, and this is for any mythology, honestly, but with Greek specifically, I'll get into why I think that that's more popular. But Greek mythology kind of shows us, and I think you hinted on this earlier, shadows of this ancient culture and how they saw the world. That's all in the myths and the way that the gods are, their interaction with the gods, the temples, the fact of how many temples they erected and all these gods honor. And it's kind of our viewpoint into what life was like in Greece, or even Rome, if you want to go, because they have their own version of their mythology. But I think that it's become so popular because Greek mythology had found a way to, even from the beginning, become widespread. And again, Romans, they created their own version of the gods too, of the same mythology, but they named them differently and maybe put their own little spin on things that satisfied their culture, which was different, from Greece. But, it became so widespread. Other mythologies, Norse, Aztec, Celtic, Egyptian, they were all more localized. And so they didn't even really have the chance to get more popular because they weren't widespread like Greek was. And Greece itself has had so much, even historically, and Rome has had so much, influence on culture and society and things that we still use to this day. So I think that it just makes sense that we would pull their mythology in with it too, because obviously if they gave us all this, architecture, culture and everything else that we still use, then there has to be something to be said about their mythology too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I love about the Greek stories is that these, sure, they're, supernatural, they're gods, but they're super flawed and
Mm-hmm.
relatable, and we can see ourselves in them. But at the same time, they're eternal in their characteristics. So when you look at angry Ares or disfigured Hephaestus being with Aphrodite, power hungry Zeus, jealous Hera, like these are all like characters that we see in people, in movies, films, books, and they're just super great. What's the word I'm thinking about? Like the prototypes. They're
Yes.
great
Yep.
prototypes for characters.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that too. And I've realized even more so when I started writing that series how true that is, because as much as, these mortals that I have them interacting with, the gods themselves kind of, discover things about themselves and grow and change. And I didn't realize actually how much what you just said is true until I started writing and realizing the journeys that they can take, even just me pulling from the myths and making them modernized. So
Yeah, exactly. And even the plots. So characters, plots, you have just pulling some off the top of my head, the pretty popular girl in school and the not so popular, maybe disfigured boy, in school getting together. Or let's see, what other ones did I write down? I write things down and then I have to remember to look for them. I don't know, name it. What's another what's okay, what is a Greek myth that you really love that's persevered, and then we could talk about how we could translate that into like a modern day movie.
Um, I mean, you kind of already brought it up with the disfigured boy and the popular girl or what have you, and that's one that I haven't actually delved into myself yet. But I think that even just that itself could be easily retold in so many different ways, or even just the grumpy meets sunshine, the
Yeah.
Hades Persephone. Um,
Yes.
yeah.
Oh, there's so many interpretations. People love
Yep.
that.
Yes.
The idea
They're
that
tropes.
exactly,
Yep.
exactly. The idea that, I'm rebelling against my mother's wishes. I'm going to go with this bad boy over here. Uh,
Exactly. Exactly. There are tropes all over the place in Greek myth, which makes them, to me, is why there's so many Greek myth retellings, is
mhm.
because they're easily translated. Now, I'm going to say easy in the sense that, obviously you have to sit down and write it, but they're just easy to translate into modern stories because of the fact that tropes are already sitting there that we know
Mhm.
and recognize.
Absolutely. Okay, so then my next question excuse me. I kind of visited it already, but do you have a Greek myth that you love that just really sunk its teeth into you and hasn't let go?
Uh, it's hard to think of specific myths because I've gotten so wrapped up in the gods themselves and almost doing psych evals on all of them.
Oh.
I will tell you though, one that I've sunk my teeth into because I've had to really dig really deep, and it can be a little controversial because some people love it and some people, but the Hades Persephone story.
Mhm.
When I was younger, I was just kind of swept up in the idea of it, and I loved it, and I still love it. But also at the same time, there's so many different avenues you can take with it, and yes, to me, there is a little bit of Stockholm syndrome there. If you are truly believing in the side of the myth where he, plots to kidnap her essentially and take her down to the underworld and eventually she'll love me, there's that side of it. Then there's some that say that she went down there and she had the choice of staying or not, but then she ate the fruit even though he warned her, and then she's stuck
Mhm.
there. So there's so many different avenues, but I guess I've never been a huge fan of the Stockholm syndrome one, and this is why. Because Hades himself is, he deserves to be loved, and not necessarily to the point where she eventually just decided to love him. And then because what else really is there for her?
Yeah.
She's got this whole, she can go up in the spring and then she has to come back down in the winter deal. But I mean, to me, it's like, what else, what other option is there? I mean, and this guy's really sweet. He's making, he created the Elysian Fields for her, all these different things. And so I just sometimes felt, it's kind of I think that he deserved to have his own love story where this woman actually loves him for him and from the very beginning, and not because of any outside interference whatsoever, which is why some people love my Hades version and some hate it, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
But that's the route that I decided to take, where this woman is not Persephone. It's Stephanie, who is Persephone has left Hades, and it's an exploration of what if somebody actually loved him from the very beginning because she decided to.
Yeah. I love that. And
yeah.
I think when it comes to readers too, they bring their own context and history and experiences. And so that would definitely explain why some people love and don't love a concept. But I remember watching I think Hercules' Legendary Journeys touched on the Persephone story. And basically what happened, I think, going off of like 10 plus years of memory here, you have Persephone who gets taken away from her mother Demeter by Hades down into the underworld. And as Persephone's down there, she starts to see this softer side to Hades and actually wants to be with him. So she eats the food that's down there, and which then eternally seals her with him for the half of the year that is winter. I just thought that was so touching.
Yeah, and like I said, it is, and I think the other reason why I decided to take a different route and to try to okay, well, this one's been done and done and done and done, and so I said, I'll be different. I'm going to try something else. So, and Hades is super popular. I also did not realize how actually popular he is until I wrote and put that book out there. I honestly, I don't know why I didn't know, but I just didn't realize, I guess, how big of a pool he actually has. And I honestly, even with Disney's Hercules, because I also even wrote a fan fiction with Megara ending up with Hades instead of Hercules. And
nice.
I did it very recently.
Gotta love that.
Yeah, all my readers actually, after I released Hades, they begged me to write. I was like, because I come from a fan fiction background originally before I ever wrote full length novels with my own stuff. So I said, you know what, I haven't written a fan fiction in a really long time, and it was super fun. Just to that Hades is the Hades from Disney, not my version. It's just completely different. And that actually, if you think about it, even though they didn't go full blown, because she ends up with Hercules, but at the beginning that was kind of a Hades Persephone deal. So I kind of continued that. Instead of her ending up with Hercules, I made it into Hades and Persephone, but with Megara.
Interesting. So, I love that. Okay. My myth that I think about a lot, I think because of its tragedy, is the Orpheus and Eurydice story. Yeah. So this is the one where Orpheus and Eurydice get married, and Eurydice gets bit by a snake and dies on their wedding night. Devastating, right? So she's down in the underworld, and Orpheus is allowed passage to the underworld to get her back. He makes a deal with Hades, and Hades allows Orpheus to take her back up to the surface as long as he walks ahead of her and does not look back at her. And I'm not sure if it varies depending on who's telling the story, but he essentially makes it out, turns to look at her before she's crossed the doorway, and because she's still on the other side, she fades away. It's done. They're forever separated. And I'm just like, oh God, that felt like one of those purposely stick the knife in you and twist it stories where it's like, oh, so much hope until the very end. And then it's like, what's the point? Like, hope is dead.
Yeah, I somehow completely forgot about that myth until you just brought it up. As soon as you said the name Orpheus, like, oh, this is when she's going to talk about it. That's sad. That is so sad.
Well, and I think what's interesting about Greek mythology is that it doesn't shy away from any particular type of narrative, right? It has joyful, sad, triggering, messed up, but adventurous. And I think that's what makes it so great for storytellers and readers. Okay, so if you had to identify the major themes in Greek mythology that carry over into modern retellings, what would those themes be?
I think redemption is a huge one. I've seen that through many, many myths, and kind of obviously really played into that with my modern retellings. I think even opposites attract is a huge one. There is a lot of tropes. I'm trying to even think of some of the second chances. Yeah, we talked about Grumpy and Sunshine, and yeah, I'm trying to even think. I had this in my head, and now I'm completely losing it.
No worries. While you're thinking, I have a contribution.
Yeah.
I went more into the writing technical side. I wanted to talk about the hero's journey, which is the
Mhm.
classic. If you think about any of the heroes, like Hercules and I think Perseus, and I'm forgetting now some
Yeah.
of the other ones. I'm sure many writers know about the hero's journey, but for those that don't, and for those that are not writers listening in, we have the beginning of the story is the ordinary world, and then the main character, gets called to adventure, which they reject. But then something pulls them into the situation. They meet with a mentor. They have to cross the threshold from who they were before to this new adventure person of them. They're this new evolved form. They go and overcome trials. They have to overcome supreme ordeals. They get rewarded for, reaching their goal. Then they end up going in the road back. And sometimes there's some resurrection in there. The idea that you aren't your true hero self unless you die. I think a good example of this is The Matrix.
Mm-hmm.
He dies, comes back, and now he's ready. And then, return to the normal world where we were at the beginning, except things are a little bit better, hopefully. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great one. I mean, I think it's for me because I am a romance writer essentially. Even I've written things that are not straight romance, that have a romance subplot, but anything I write even has at least a romance subplot going on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just something that I found that I just it's easier for me to navigate. Just as a writer, it's just my niche. And so I think for me, because that was a great one bringing up that hero thing. I hadn't even really thought about that. I see my brain is automatically hardwired to really, when I'm reading any of these myths, it's automatically going into what romance tropes can I pull out of this
Okay.
to pull into.
So then tell me about the romance side of the house. Like what are their tropes and structures?
So yeah, so one thing that is really apparent is there's a lot I've noticed in these myths of proving your true love, and even one that you brought about Orpheus. That is tragically, he wanted to look at her because she had been dead and now she's up on the surface with him, and of course he's gonna want to look at her. So that's tragic example of love. But one thing that also comes up in my brain is the Eros story. Now, some people believe in the side of Eros that is a primordial, but if you go with the storyline of that's Aphrodite's son, then you have to think about Psyche. And myself, I did the exact kind of myth of the whole deal where Psyche, Aphrodite's jealous of her. This is very all stuff that can actually happen. Jealous mom of her only son of this woman. And she is also extremely beautiful. She's immortal. She's not even a goddess. And people are ignoring Aphrodite because of this beautiful mortal woman. So she gets even jealous more because of that. And then her dad is praying to Aphrodite so that his daughter can have a suitor, and she can't seem to find one who actually wants to marry her. They just like her because of her beauty type deal. And Aphrodite hears his prayers, but decides to be all conniving about it and gets Eros involved, and he doesn't expect to fall in love with her. And so her whole plan goes awry, even when, he tells Psyche, you're not to look at me. You can't ever look at me. And of course she does. And it's just all this, to prove your true love, then Aphrodite is all, you have to do these trials. You mentioned trials. So this is the opposite of a hero doing trials to save what have you. But this is a woman who's put through trials, or a man, to prove their love for the other. And they'll go, through hell and high water to prove it. And that was one thing that I noticed. It happens quite often. I can't think of another one right off the top of my head, but there's at least 3 instances where I saw, and they may have not been as extravagant as what Aphrodite tried to put Psyche through, but they're definitely there. Is constantly. And I kind of explored, well, why do they have to prove their love in such a way? Why can't it be through, even unspoken word, subtle little things that somebody does can be a proof of love without them ever even having to say it. So, I mean, with Eros, I did it actually where she couldn't even say the words, and it was a big, huge thing for her. And then in Zeus, though, it's completely different because he doesn't even know or realize that he knows how to love, because his entire life has just been about it has been about sexual conquest and all, just he likes women. I mean, I don't negate that fact. Zeus is Zeus, and he will always be synonymous with liking women. But there's a different discovery there about how to love, and how that's a continuous theme too, I find, is how to love, and even maybe not another person but yourself. And that's something that I find a lot in those myths too.
So as a romance writer, when you're looking at the plethora of Greek mythologies to kind of get inspired by, there's a dark side of love, and we've touched on this before. I'm going to specifically talk about Apollo and Daphne, that myth. This is the one where Apollo is the sun god, and he falls in love with Daphne, this beautiful nymph. I believe it might have been a circumstance where Cupid shot him with an arrow and he saw Daphne, and at the same time she was also shot with an arrow that would make her always be repelled by him. I think it was one of those circumstances. And so as Apollo is endlessly pursuing Daphne, and she's running away from him, she finally asks for help from her father, who is the river god, and right when Apollo catches her, she gets transformed into a tree. And even then, Apollo still loves her as a tree. And I think one of the more chilling aspects that come out of the story is when he embraces her, and because she's a tree, this is what the quote says: "My bride," he said, "since you can never be, at least, sweet laurel, you shall be my tree. My lure, my locks, my quiver you shall wreathe." And upon hearing his words, Daphne bends her branches, unable to stop it. So when you have like really interesting, chilling scenes like that, from the romance writer's perspective, what is your biggest challenge translating things that might be otherwise ugly to be better received, or to give it a better narrative?
So really funny that you brought up that, because my Apollo book, huge aspect, that entire myth you just described, and it comes up in Eros too, because obviously it involves both of them, and Eros and Apollo in my series just really don't like each other. And it really did. It spawned from an archery rivalry, and then Eros doing that. But I try. I try to make light of it and I get to have some creative license. And yes, I do that entire situation happens in my series where he falls in love with her, and eventually keeps in love with a tree. But I have it in my series, and this may be a cop out, but it is what it is.
Okay.
I have Eros eventually, but we're talking hundreds of years later. So he is being tortured by this, and this poor Daphne is also, still stuck as a tree. He lifts the curse. Eros eventually does lift the curse, because the thing is, though, Eros even starts out too, he's this arrogant little brat, and he does start like that. A lot of these gods start arrogant, but because if let's just say, if they're real, they've been around for thousands of years. You cannot tell me that at some point in time they would have started to grow and change too, regardless of them being deities or not. And so that is what I had, that he still despises Apollo, but he feels bad for Daphne, and so he lifts the curse so that she can be whole again. But in turn, he has to lift the curse on Apollo too, but he does do it because he changes, he grows, and he realizes that, okay, that might have been a little bit extreme. So that's how I kind of tried it. And again, I had mentioned earlier Poseidon and Medusa. In the actual myth, I mean, he basically rapes her. And I, didn't want to include that in my stories. It's just I really try to keep the super tragic stuff. There's still some tragic stuff because that's life, but I try to keep the really, really, really dark stuff, because I don't write dark romances. I write, feel good romances. And so I, decided I can't really say exactly what I did on air here, but because it's be a spoiler. But I did find a way to work around and not only give Poseidon some redemption in the whole situation. I also put some Athena, giving her some, because she's the one who did the curse in the first place, and it was a little, arrogant on her part of why she did it, because it happened in her temple and she was kind of, hurt about it. So I give her, she has to take some responsibility in there too, and I do give her that. And then also, though, Medusa is also going to get some redemption in my story too, because I feel like she does not get killed by Theseus, was it? Theseus? Perseus. I can't remember what Isis was to kill her right now.
I'm the same way.
One of those us's killed her. But I took it out that actually Poseidon is the one who heard it being talked about on Olympus that it was going to happen, and he made a deal with the hero it had something to do with a king, and he was going to take care of it so that he wouldn't actually go and kill Medusa. So I actually switched it around where Poseidon saved Medusa's life and she didn't know it. So this is just different ways that I really make sure that I know the original myth, and then I look at the big picture and go, okay, how can I keep with the myth but make it to the point where it's not as tragic as what may have actually happened in myth. So.
Gotcha. Okay, so then as writers, we think a lot about our audience, how our audience would receive something, especially for thinking about books that could be distributed to as many readers as possible. In your research for Greek mythology, were you able to pick up on anything that told you about what the audience was like back then and how the stories, the original Greek myths, are a reflection on their needs?
Yeah, and I feel so, and this is the truth of it. I mean, even when you read historically about Greece, they definitely were very, free-minded people. They had orgies and they had these big parties, and it did involve sex and wine and partying and everything like that, which I think actually Dionysus is a representation of that as a whole.
Yeah.
But I think each god definitely did represent something about their culture, and I think that you can definitely it kind of takes into play of researching history plus the myths to be able to see the connections there, which I haven't delved as much in the historical side of things. I mean, I do know quite a bit about Greek and Roman history, but I definitely see it reflected there, even in just the temples. Which ones did they actually have? Who had the most? Who had the biggest? That really comes into play there, even down to the fact of Amphitrite is Poseidon's queen. And I really kind of dig into that because a lot of people don't even remember her name. But yet there were areas of Greece that she was extremely revered, and they worshipped her. And that was their particular god. And Venus de Milo, that statue with the arms cut off.
Yeah.
I actually recently just found out something a few months ago that there is some theory that they don't think that it's Aphrodite at all, which also, to begin with, since it was found in Greece, it was funny they called it Venus de Milo because, as we know, that's the Roman name for her.
Mm-hmm.
So that right there was a little odd, but she was found near that, the temple is gone now, but near that area where they worshipped Amphitrite. So their theory is, and I actually wonder if this is true, is that statue is actually her and not Aphrodite. So there's like different things like that you can really, even today, Aphrodite was so popular, they just automatically assumed that had to be her. And, she's beautiful. It has to be the goddess of love. And I think that is kind of a say as to, their culture too, as far as, which god they worshipped. And even like Hades didn't, or Ares, they were called cults if they worshipped Ares, not, worshipers. And there weren't really many temples in his honor, nor Hades, because I think they feared Hades, obviously, because of what he was.
Okay.
But that's the thing too. And also us as a culture kind of, giving Hades he's the death of everything, when there's an actual god of death who actually is the one, Thanatos, who actually, takes the spirits. But then they also really focused on Hades, fearing him when he's just kind of a divider of souls in my eyes. He's not really the one who, takes you from the surface and brings you down. He's just the one you see when you get there. So
yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like correlation doesn't equal causation.
Exactly, exactly. And I think it can even be played into other, Lucifer and other, gods of, death or, or hell or Tartarus or whatever you want to call them. But I think that's a constant theme there, and they had it too. So,
So when we look at Greek mythology, we're pulling from stories, we're pulling from statues, we're pulling from a lot of culture. So hypothetically, if we're thinking into the future several hundred years and people from the future are looking back at our American culture, what do you think that they're going to see as mythological from now?
so a big thing that I've actually been toying this with in my brain of kind of playing off it myself, but the idea of the American cowboy, I think that's going to eventually be absolute complete myth to the point where we're obviously a baby country. America is a baby country, and I kind of see cowboys as our answer to we needed some form of hero, idealizing them, making, putting them on a pedestal to the point where they're not just cattle ropers. They have become these, icons of history, the old West and gunslingers and heroes essentially. And then you also have the bad guys to the cowboys who, and yeah, there was some, historical aspects, but when you really dig deep into it, they're almost, how Europe put knights on this pedestal too. They've kind of been glorified. I think that cowboys are our version of knights, and eventually I think they're just going to be complete myth, because a lot of the things you hear about cowboys and in the Old West, some of it is, fictional, and I think that over time the fictional has become intertwined with fact to the point where sometimes I even have to look stuff up and is this true? Did this actually ever happen? So I think that is actually going to be, almost, when we see King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, is there some fact there? Maybe, but what is fact versus fiction in that whole story? I think that that's eventually going to be cowboys for America as well.
Interesting. Okay. I went into a more, let's see, fictional world because was trying to think like if someone dug up I don't know, a CD or a disc or something, even though everything we do is cloud-based. I don't know. So I don't know how easy that would be, especially with the prevalence of streaming and you don't have to have your DVD collection anymore. Um, but I was thinking Marvel, DC comics, I think those are like an easy kind of, assumption to make. Part of me wonders if today's influencers and the lore behind influencer will take off and kind of evolve into something, especially because it's such a nebulous idea on what influencing means, but yet so numerous. That's kind of just one thought I had.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think was it Neil Gaiman, as far as the neon gods type concept.
Okay.
That was something too that I was trying to think about how to even, describe what I was thinking as far as technology being seen as, obviously technology is going to just continue to skyrocket, and we might have, AI robots and all this stuff. However, let's even talk way in the future. Let's just say hypothetically that we get back to a Stone Age period, or all technology gets knocked out, or apocalyptic type scenario that we get back to, and then technology maybe was seen as how he kind of described it too, as worshiping. They've become these gods, whereas it's technology, so they're not necessarily, but I could see how another culture from even another part of the galaxy might see that as, oh, this species viewed what they may actually already have even in their arsenal. They viewed it as almost, they put it on this worshiping status. They had it with them constantly, and
The
they
cell
really,
phone.
yeah, and they
Uh-huh.
really just let it control their lives, whereas maybe this other species is using it to enrich their lives versus controlling them. So that's something I've always thought about too, is them, kind of us worshiping technology versus using it to our advantage and letting it control us. So
That makes me think. I was listening to another podcast. It's my guilty pleasure. It's called Fluently Forward. It's about celebrity blind item gossip. But the thing that I found to be so interesting is the use of uh they're like army bots. And so let's say that you're a celebrity and someone puts out something negative about you. You can have bots, like basically other
Mhm.
social media accounts, start flooding things on your behalf with saying whatever they need to say to support you. And depending on the algorithms, depending on the quantity, now, another person who just comes across this news item and reads something probably bad about you, they read the comments and they see a lot of people saying, that's not true. That can't be true. This person's great. And it's all these hired bots. It's not real people. And how that shapes your perception of people, and how not only is it something that's being done to you, but you could, if you were rich enough, I guess, buy that service. And when you talk about being controlled or being influenced by technology, how what's happening right now. So when I learned about that, I was like, oh
Yeah.
gosh, don't trust anything.
Oh yeah, yeah. There was I forget what the name of that documentary was recently on Netflix, The Social something, but they go into that really, really heavy, and it is very a bit scary about how you're unknowingly being really influenced, and it's I think we're all at fault, and it's almost impossible because it is everywhere. And as we just said, cell phones, we all have them, we all have the apps, we all have some form of social media connection, and it's definitely it's there. So it's just a matter of, again, it's trying to not let it control you as much as you possibly can, but also at the end of the day, it's how do you even know when that's happening?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I have some writing questions for you.
Okay.
What is the most difficult type of character to write?
Oh, well, it took me a long time trying to write from a male perspective.
Okay.
Very difficult. I avoided it for a long time until recently. I basically Zeus is my first full dual POV book, and a lot of people kept asking me, and I was hesitant because I've read some really well done points of view from the opposite gender. I mean, a guy, doing a female point of view or vice versa. And I've read some really bad ones. So I really didn't want to be on the latter end of that. I wanted to be, I wanted to be done well. So I decided to wait. And then I realized that I knew the voice of Zeus pretty well. And so I wrote one chapter and I had some people read it. I even had my husband read it, which and I have no fault to him. He doesn't read my stuff really because it's romance and he's just not into it, and that's fine. But I did have him read it because I just needed him to tell me, does this sound even plausibly like it could be from a guy's brain? And that is really difficult for me because you can either push it too far or you can make it completely unrealistic. Now, it's a romance book, so yes, there's a bit of a fantasy in there. So there may not be 100% situations where, oh, a guy would never say or do that. Well, it's a romance, so in my brain, he is this time. But I really I wanted to keep it as close as I could while also giving that license. And so that has been the most difficult for me. And even then, I have to, step out of using those same words that I would use or the heroine would use because it's not the same person. And it's really hard to step out of what you normally would think as a female to be able to situate it into a male. Like, how are they perceiving this situation? And it's difficult. I think that's definitely the most challenge for me.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing that with me. I
Yeah,
appreciate that.
absolutely.
And then for listeners wanting to write a Greek myth retelling, what is your main advice?
Research, research, research. I can't stress that enough, because you're going to have some people reading your retellings that are green to Greek mythology and just coming in for the fun of it, and they want to learn more about it. And then you're going to have ones that are very versed in the myths. And even if you're taking some license on it, which most of the people, if they read these, they realize that they are still going to be, looking to see, does this person are they just maybe doing the retellings because they see the popularity, or are they actually invested in, making sure that they know where these myths are coming from? And you can tell, and the people that are familiar with it can tell. So definitely make sure that you have your research. If you're trying to go with do the Greek spelling of the gods, make sure you stick with it and know what they are. and just really make sure that you know your background on these characters, even if you plan on changing them, so that you know even where they're coming from as you're going through the retellings. So that way new people can learn, and versed people can say, yep, she knows what she's talking about.
Awesome. Well, Carly, thank you for being on the podcast. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with or to promote before you go?
Zeus is going to be coming out April 25th. It's on pre-order right now, and there is an incentive with a free art print and bookmark if you show proof of pre-order. The link for that you can find on any of my social media pages easily enough. But really looking forward to it, and I hope that I can convince people that Zeus is not as bad as you think he is, and he's actually a pretty sexy god king.
Speculative Sandbox is a volunteer-run podcast that relies on the collaboration of fellow creators like you. Join the conversation and participate in fun polls and questionnaires on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Interested in being in a future episode? Our DMs are open, or you can email speculativesandbox@gmail.com.